Megan Taylor, a high school teacher now, never really liked talking about her childhood home. It was a typical suburban neighborhood, quiet, peaceful, exactly the kind of place you'd expect nothing strange to ever happen. But for Megan, it was anything but typical. Her backyard had a swing set, one her father built with his own hands, but she never played on it much. It was the kind of thing most kids would love, but not Megan. The thing is, it always moved. She couldn't explain it. Even on the stillest, calmest nights, she'd see it swinging gently, as if someone invisible was giving it a soft push. It started when she was about 7. At first, she thought it was the wind, even when she couldn't feel a breeze. Her parents brushed it off, saying swings do that sometimes, that maybe it was loosening from the tree. But she knew better. Kids notice things adults don't, like the way the swing never swayed when she was watching it from inside the house. It would wait until she turned away, and then she'd see it out of the corner of her eye, back and forth, back and forth. As the days passed, the swing's movement became more regular, almost like it had a schedule. Megan couldn't ignore it anymore. She told her parents again and again, but they always had the same answer. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart." She hated that response, the way they dismissed her so easily. But Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And not just wrong, off, in a way she couldn't explain, even to herself. One evening, she sat in her bedroom, staring out the window, watching the swing move again. This time, she tried to time it, counting the seconds between each swing. It was eerily rhythmic, almost too perfect, and then it stopped. Just like that, mid-swing, like someone had grabbed it. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She waited, but nothing else happened that night. Still, the image of that sudden stop haunted her dreams. Megan started avoiding the backyard altogether. It didn't feel safe anymore, though she couldn't pinpoint why. The swing wasn't doing anything outright scary, no ghosts or strange noises, just the constant quiet motion. And yet, it terrified her in a way she couldn't explain. No one else seemed to notice, and the more she talked about it, the more her parents insisted it was in her head. Megan stopped mentioning it, but the unease never left her. Even as she grew older, Megan couldn't shake the memory of that swing. It felt like the beginning of something, though she didn't know what. She just knew it wasn't over. Even as she moved through the normal routines of childhood, playing with friends, going to school, that swing was always at the back of her mind. It became a permanent part of her life, a strange, unsettling detail that hovered just out of reach, waiting for something else to happen. But Megan had no idea how much worse it was going to get. It was a cool autumn evening when Megan saw it for the first time. She had been watching the swing again, as she often did, from her bedroom window. The swing, as usual, moved slowly, rhythmically, but this time, something was different. Her heart started pounding in her chest, and she couldn't quite put her finger on why, until she saw the figure. At first it was barely noticeable, almost a shadow, sitting there on the swing. She squinted, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her, but it was there, thin, hollow, and still. The figure was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Its limbs were long, unnaturally so, and its body seemed emaciated, like it had been starved for years. But the most disturbing thing was its face, or lack thereof. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank space where a face should be. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to call for her parents, but no sound came out. She was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to look away. For what felt like hours, Megan stood there, staring at the figure. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge her in any way. It just sat there, swinging gently, back and forth. Finally, she forced herself to close her eyes, hoping that when she opened them, it would be gone. But when she looked again, the swing was empty. The figure had vanished, leaving only the slow creaking of the swing behind. Megan backed away from the window, heart still racing. She didn't sleep that night. From that point on, the figure appeared regularly. Every night, like clockwork, it would return to the swing. Each time, it seemed more solid, more real. Megan would watch from her window, heart pounding, but she never dared go outside. She never even told her parents about it. They hadn't believed her about the swing, so why would they believe her now? No, This was something she had to deal with on her own. The figure never moved from the swing, never tried to come closer. But that didn't make it any less terrifying. In fact, its stillness was what scared Megan the most. It was like it was waiting for something, but she didn't know what. She began to dread the nights, knowing that as soon as the sun went down, the figure would appear again. And every time, it seemed just a little bit more real. Megan tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but the figure became impossible to avoid. Even when she wasn't looking out the window, she could feel it. The weight of its presence hung over her like a dark cloud, suffocating her. She started sleeping with the blinds closed, but it didn't help. She knew it was still there, sitting on the swing, watching. What scared Megan the most was the growing certainty that the figure was getting stronger. It wasn't just her imagination. The figure was becoming more solid, more present, with each passing night. She didn't know what it wanted, but she was terrified that soon it wouldn't be content to just sit on the swing. It was only a matter of time before it did something worse. As the days passed, Megan's fear intensified. The figure hadn't done anything, hadn't spoken, hadn't moved toward her, but it didn't need to. Its very presence was enough to fill her with a deep, bone-chilling dread. She couldn't understand how something so still could be so terrifying, but every night it was there, and every night it seemed more solid, more tangible. The swing's gentle creaking, once almost soothing, now sounded like a threat. The real terror set in when she started hearing the swing even when she wasn't looking at it. She would be lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to block out the fear, and suddenly she'd hear the ropes creak, just a soft rhythmic sound, like someone was gently pushing the swing. Her heart would race, her palms would sweat, but she refused to look. Looking meant acknowledging it was real, and Megan didn't want to admit that, not even to herself. But the sound haunted her, even in her dreams. It wasn't just the sound of the swing that unsettled her. One night, after another restless evening of trying to ignore the creaking, Megan glanced out the window and saw something new. The swing ropes had been tied in a tight, deliberate knot. It wasn't a knot that could have formed by accident, not from the wind or even someone brushing past it. No, this was something intentional, something meant to get her attention. Her stomach churned with fear. The figure wasn't just watching anymore. It was toying with her. Megan's parents still didn't believe her, of course. They had long since dismissed her stories as the wild imagination of a child. But Megan knew better. She knew the figure wasn't just in her head. It was real, and it was getting bolder. She began to dread the nights more than ever, afraid of what the figure would do next. What if it decided to come closer? What if it didn't stop at the swing? She started sleeping with the lights on, hoping it would give her some sense of security, but the light did nothing to stop the fear. Every night, the creaking of the swing would start, and Megan's heart would pound in her chest. She would lie there, paralyzed, too afraid to even breathe, knowing that the figure was out there, just beyond her window, watching, waiting. The nights seemed to stretch on forever, filled with that maddening creaking and the overwhelming sense of being watched. Megan considered leaving, packing a bag and running as far away from that house as possible. But something held her back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the hope that if she stayed, she could somehow figure out what the figure wanted. Or maybe it was something else, something darker, that kept her tied to that swing. She didn't know anymore. All she knew was that she couldn't leave, not yet. But as the figure grew more solid, more present, Megan knew she was running out of time. The fear was becoming unbearable, suffocating her, and she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Something had to change. Something had to give. But Megan wasn't sure she wanted to find out what that something was. Megan's unease turned into sheer terror as the figure began to appear outside of her backyard. It no longer confined itself to the swing. She would catch fleeting glimpses of it in the most unexpected places. At school, she'd spot it in the distance, standing motionless in the parking lot, blending in with the shadows. On walks through her neighborhood, it would be there, just beyond her line of sight. It was always far enough away that no one else seemed to notice, but close enough that Megan knew it was watching her. The worst was when she started seeing it inside her own home. At first, it was only reflections. She'd be brushing her teeth and glance at the mirror, only to catch a glimpse of that long, hollow figure standing behind her. When she'd spin around, there'd be nothing there, but the feeling would linger, like a cold shiver running down her spine. The house that had once been her safe haven now felt like a prison, and no matter where she went, she couldn't escape its watchful gaze. One night, after days of catching these glimpses and feeling its presence creeping closer, Megan finally faced the figure directly. She had been watching it from her window again, just as she had so many nights before. The swing moved back and forth in its slow, eerie rhythm, and the figure sat as it always did, long limbs hanging loosely from the swing. But something was different this time. The figure wasn't just sitting, it was looking at her, or at least she thought it was. Its featureless face seemed to be turned in her direction, and for the first time, Megan felt like it could really see her. Her heart pounded in her chest as the figure did something it had never done before. It stopped swinging. The sudden stillness was deafening. Megan couldn't breathe, couldn't think, as she watched in horror. Slowly, almost deliberately, the figure stood up. It didn't move toward her, didn't need to. But the act of standing was enough to send Megan into a panic. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, and for a moment she couldn't move. She wanted to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. Without thinking, she slammed the blinds shut, her hands trembling violently. She stumbled back from the window, her heart racing, her mind spinning. It was too late. The figure had seen her. Megan knew that. She could feel it. She could sense it, like a cold, oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. It wasn't just watching from the swing anymore. It was coming for her. And for the first time, Megan felt completely powerless. She spent the rest of the night huddled under her blankets, trying to convince herself that she was safe inside her room. But deep down, she knew the truth. The figure wasn't just some distant presence anymore. It had crossed a line, and whatever came next, Megan wasn't sure she was ready for it. After that night, Megan made the decision to leave her childhood home. She thought that by moving away, by putting physical distance between herself and the swing set, she could finally escape the figure. So she packed her bags and moved across town, hoping for a fresh start, a life free from the fear that had gripped her for so long. For a while, it seemed to work. In her new apartment, there were no swings, no shadows lurking outside her window, but the relief was short-lived. Late one night, a familiar sound broke the silence, the soft creak of a swing moving back and forth. At first, Megan thought she was imagining it, her mind playing tricks on her. But then it came again, louder this time, more distinct. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and strained her ears. There it was, the unmistakable creak of the swing. Her stomach twisted with dread. She hadn't escaped it. The figure had followed her. She didn't dare look out the window. She knew what she would see. The same hollow, emaciated figure sitting on a swing that shouldn't exist. Even though she hadn't seen the figure in weeks, she could feel it now, as clearly as if it were sitting at the foot of her bed. The oppressive weight of its presence was suffocating. It didn't need to show itself anymore. Megan knew it was there, always watching, always waiting. Megan started avoiding places where there might be swings, parks, schoolyards, even certain streets where she knew children played. She refused to go near playgrounds, terrified that she might catch a glimpse of the figure again. But it didn't matter how careful she was. Every so often, usually in the dead of night, she would hear the swing creaking, taunting her, reminding her that she could never truly escape. The sound followed her, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. No matter how hard she tried to rebuild her life, the figure was always there, lurking just out of sight. Megan stopped looking out her windows altogether. She kept the blinds closed, the curtains drawn, but it wasn't enough to block out the fear. In her darkest moments, she wondered if the figure was inside with her, hiding in the corners of her mind, biding its time. The thought was almost too much to bear. The nights became unbearable. Sleep offered no respite, as her dreams were plagued with the image of the swing, the figure growing more solid, more real with each passing night. Megan could feel its presence even in her waking moments, a constant reminder that it was never far away. She knew the figure was waiting, But for what, she couldn't say. All she knew was that it was only a matter of time before it made its next move. Megan never told anyone about the figure. Who would believe her? It wasn't something she could explain, not even to herself. But she knew deep down that the haunting would never end. The figure wasn't just a part of her past, it was a part of her now, woven into the fabric of her life. And as the creaking of the swing echoed in her ears, Megan realized that no matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, the figure would always be there, watching, waiting, and growing stronger with each passing day. David Long, a 34-year-old software engineer, had always lived a pretty uneventful life, until the night that changed everything. Growing up in a small suburb of Ohio, he was used to the quiet, peaceful nights of his childhood home. His parents were loving, his friends close by, and everything seemed normal. But that all started to shift on the summer of his 12th birthday. He remembers that night as if it happened yesterday. The air was thick with heat, the windows slightly cracked to let in the cool evening breeze, but it wasn't enough to keep the room comfortable. That's when David first noticed it. He'd been staring at his bedroom wall, the one opposite his bed, lit faintly by the soft glow of moonlight. His eyes had just started to grow heavy with sleep when a flicker caught his attention. At first, he assumed it was just a passing cloud, or maybe a car's headlights bouncing off the wall, but as he focused, the flickering shadow stayed. It wasn't moving the way shadows normally did. There was no source, no explanation. It just hovered there, pulsating slightly like it was breathing. David sat up in bed, blinking hard, trying to shake the sleep from his eyes. But the shadow didn't disappear. It seemed to dance in and out of view, as if teasing him, daring him to question what he was seeing. At first, he laughed at himself, chalking it up to exhaustion, or maybe even an overactive imagination. Kids get scared sometimes, right? But then it moved, just slightly closer. And that's when David knew something was off. This wasn't a trick of the light. It was something more. Something wrong. He reached for the lamp beside his bed, fingers trembling as they fumbled with the switch. The second the room flooded with light, the shadow vanished, leaving nothing but the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the distant sound of crickets chirping outside. David's heart raced as he scanned the room, trying to convince himself that everything was fine. But the feeling in his gut told him otherwise. That shadow had been real, and somehow, he knew it wasn't the last time he'd see it. The next morning, David tried to push the experience out of his mind. He didn't mention it to his parents, not wanting to sound foolish. After all, what was he supposed to say? That a shadow on the wall had moved on its own? No, that would be ridiculous. Instead, he went about his day like normal, but the memory of that flickering shape lingered in the back of his mind, casting a quiet unease over everything. It felt like something had shifted in his life, like a door had been opened to something he couldn't quite understand. As the sun began to set again that evening, David's thoughts drifted back to the night before. He found himself dreading the moment he'd have to return to his room, and for the first time in his life, he was genuinely afraid of the dark. That shadow had done more than just spook him. It had planted a seed of fear, one that he couldn't shake. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, deep down, David knew the shadow wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the right moment to return, and when it did, David's life would never be the same again. A few days passed before the shadow returned, and when it did, it was no longer shy. David had almost convinced himself that it was all just a weird dream, a product of his imagination playing tricks on him. But that night, as he lay in bed, the air seemed thicker, the room quieter than usual, like something was waiting. That's when he saw it again, this time more defined, sharper around the edges. It didn't just hover in the corner anymore. The shadow stretched almost as if it was reaching out, inching closer to his bed. David's heart pounded as he watched it move. There was something deliberate about the way it crept along the wall, like it had a purpose, a destination. He tried to rationalize it again. Maybe it was a shadow from outside, a tree branch swaying in the breeze. But no, There were no trees near his window, and the shadow had an eerie consistency to it, like it was alive, avoiding the moonlight but growing bolder in the darkness. He considered calling out to his parents, but what would he say? That a shadow was moving? That didn't seem like the kind of thing his parents would take seriously. So he stayed quiet, pulling the covers up to his chin, his eyes never leaving the figure on the wall. He watched as it came closer, almost as if it were testing him, waiting to see how much he could handle. For the first time, David felt a true sense of dread wash over him. Not the kind you get from a scary movie, but the kind that grips you when you know something is terribly wrong. When morning came, the shadow was gone again, as if it had never been there at all. David got up, bleary-eyed from another restless night, and went about his day pretending everything was normal. But inside he knew something was happening, something he couldn't explain. He tried talking to his parents, casually mentioning that he thought he saw something strange in his room. They brushed it off just as he expected. "You're probably just tired, David," his mom had said with a laugh. Kids see all sorts of things when they don't get enough sleep. But it wasn't just his imagination, and deep down, David knew it. The next night, the shadow returned again, and this time it wasn't just moving. As David lay there staring at the wall, he heard it. At first it was barely noticeable, a faint murmur like someone speaking from far away. He strained his ears, unsure if it was real or just the wind outside. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, until he could make out words. It wasn't a whisper, but a soft, eerie voice promising safety. "Let me in," it said, "and you'll never have to be afraid again." David's blood ran cold. Safety? From what? He didn't respond. Instead, he pulled the covers tighter, his heart racing in his chest. He knew better than to engage with whatever this was. But the curiosity was there, gnawing at the edges of his fear. What would happen if he let it in? Could it really protect him? Or was this some kind of trap? The shadow continued to linger, its presence filling the room with a sense of unease. The following day, David could barely focus at school. The shadow had started to invade his thoughts, making it hard to concentrate on anything else. Every dark corner, every flicker of light, made him jump. He didn't tell anyone, not even his friends, about the voice or the shadow. It was his secret, a terrifying one, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it to himself. Weeks went by, and the shadow became a nightly visitor. It no longer waited for darkness to fully descend before making its appearance. David began noticing it earlier, just as dusk set in, and with each passing day, it seemed to grow more confident, more solid. His room became a prison of sorts. He felt trapped by the mere thought of going to bed, knowing the shadow would be waiting for him. Sleep was no longer restful. Every time he closed his eyes, he'd wake with a start, convinced the shadow was looming right over him. At first, David tried staying up late, avoiding his room as long as possible. He'd sit in the living room with the TV on, pretending to doze off on the couch. But his parents eventually sent him to bed, unaware of the growing terror their son faced. He thought about sleeping with the lights on, but somehow, he knew that wouldn't stop the shadow. It seemed to thrive in the places where the light couldn't quite reach, and he feared the presence wouldn't be bound by something as simple as a lamp. It wasn't long before the shadow started appearing in other parts of the house. He'd see it out of the corner of his eye in the hallway, or lingering in the living room when he was home alone after school. It never fully revealed itself outside his room, but its presence was unmistakable. David was starting to feel like he was losing control. He couldn't explain it to anyone without sounding crazy, and the worst part was that no one else could see it. It was as if the shadow had singled him out, chosen him as its target, and there was no escape. One evening, David saw the shadow in the most unexpected place, outside. He'd been walking home from a friend's house, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. As he approached his house, there it was, standing at the edge of the yard near his bedroom window, just waiting. For a moment, David froze, his heart pounding in his chest. How could it be outside? Had it always been there, watching him from a distance? He didn't dare approach it, Instead, he bolted for the front door, slamming it shut behind him, feeling a cold sweat break out across his skin. David's nights became a routine of fear and exhaustion. He tried everything to get rid of the shadow, moving his bed, saying prayers, even rearranging the room in a desperate attempt to disrupt whatever was happening. But nothing worked. The shadow was always there, always creeping closer. And as the days passed, he started to notice something even more disturbing. The voice was getting louder. It wasn't just faint murmurs anymore. The words were clearer and the promises of safety more enticing. The fear began to consume David's every thought. He couldn't focus at school, couldn't enjoy time with his friends. It felt like the shadow was slowly draining the life out of him, feeding on his terror. The worst part was the isolation. No one else could understand what he was going through. He was utterly alone in this nightmare, and the shadow knew it. Every night, it crept closer, pushing him to the edge, testing how far it could go before he broke. David knew that he couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. The shadow wasn't going away. It was only getting stronger. And the voice. That voice was growing harder to ignore. The promises of safety, of protection from some unnamed danger, began to play on his mind. Could the shadow really keep him safe? From what? The fear gnawed at him, but so did the temptation. What would happen if he just gave in? It was a particularly cold evening when David reached his breaking point. He'd spent yet another sleepless night staring at the shadow as it stretched across his room, bigger and darker than ever before. His nerves were frayed, his body exhausted, and his mind teetered on the edge of giving up. As he lay there, barely able to keep his eyes open, the voice returned, but this time it wasn't a faint murmur. It was clear, distinct, and louder than it had ever been. The shadow was no longer content with just lurking. It wanted something more. David watched in horror as the shadow grew, its edges becoming sharper, more defined. It stood right beside his bed now, towering over him, so close he could almost feel its presence pressing against his skin. The voice came again, calm and soothing, as if it were offering him a solution to all his problems. "Let me in," it said, "and I will protect you. You'll never have to fear anything again. Just let me in." The words seemed to echo in David's mind, filling the room with a strange, oppressive energy. For a moment, David considered it. He was tired, so tired, and the thought of finally being free from the fear that had haunted him for weeks was tempting. The shadow's promises of protection sounded like a lifeline, a way out of the endless nightmare he'd been living. But deep down, something in his gut told him not to trust it. The voice, no matter how soothing, was not human. The promises it made felt hollow, like they came from something that didn't truly understand what safety meant. David took a deep breath, his hands gripping the sheets tightly. He refused. He didn't say it aloud, but his thoughts were clear. He wouldn't let it in. The shadow seemed to pause, as if it were surprised by his decision. For a moment, the room was deathly silent, the air thick with tension. Then, without warning, the shadow lashed out. It didn't touch David directly, but the force of its presence was enough to shake the room. Pictures flew off the walls, books toppled from the shelves, and the lamp on his nightstand shattered. David's heart raced as he scrambled out of bed, backing into the corner of the room. The shadow loomed larger now, its form almost filling the entire space. It wasn't just angry, it was testing him, seeing how far it could push before he broke. But even in his terror, David stood his ground. He wouldn't let it win. Not tonight. He couldn't. The room shook violently for what felt like an eternity before the shadow finally began to retreat, shrinking back into its usual spot in the corner of the room. The silence that followed was deafening. David stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with fear. The shadow was still there, but it had stopped its rampage, as if accepting that tonight it wouldn't get what it wanted. But David knew this wasn't over. The shadow wasn't gone. It had simply backed off for now, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The voice, once so clear and persuasive, had gone silent. But David could still feel it in the air, lurking, watching, biding its time. As he crawled back into bed, his body trembling from the adrenaline, David realized that the shadow wasn't just a threat. It was patient. It had offered him a deal, and when he refused, it didn't leave. It stayed, waiting for the moment when his defenses would crumble. And deep down, David knew that moment would come. The shadow had all the time in the world, and eventually it would make its offer again. The question was, how long could he resist? Years have passed since that fateful night, but the shadow has never truly left David's life. Now 34, living in a different city and far from the home where it all began, David thought distance might offer some peace. But the shadow had never been bound by a place. It followed him, lurking in every dark corner, waiting for the moment his guard would slip. Even now, as an adult, David can still feel its cold presence. The shadow had grown patient, more so than David could have ever anticipated. In his new apartment, David tried to live a normal life. He has a job, friends, even hobbies that keep him busy. But the shadow's quiet persistence haunts him, never fully letting him forget. At night, as he settles into bed, he feels it, its gaze, its weight. It no longer moves violently or makes offers. Instead, it lingers in the background, waiting, always waiting. Sometimes David wonders if it's testing him, waiting for that one moment when exhaustion, fear, or hopelessness will push him to finally let it in. David has learned to live with the constant presence, even though it never stops unnerving him. He tries not to show his fear, knowing that the shadow feeds on it. Over the years, he's become adept at managing the anxiety it brings, but he can never fully escape the dread that builds every time the sun goes down. He knows it's still there, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. It has grown quiet, but its silence is more terrifying than its voice ever was. Every now and then, David catches glimpses of the shadow in unexpected places. A fleeting flicker in a darkened alleyway, a strange shape in the corner of his bathroom mirror. These moments remind him that no matter where he goes, no matter how much he tries to outrun it, the shadow will always follow. It has become a part of his life, a constant, ever-present threat that he can't shake off. The thought of it is exhausting, but what terrifies David most is the knowledge that the shadow will never grow tired. David sometimes wonders if he'll ever slip. There are nights when he feels weak, when the weight of everything becomes too much to bear. In those moments, he feels the shadow's presence grow stronger, as if sensing his vulnerability. It's patient, knowing that it only needs one moment of weakness to finally get what it wants. David's defenses may be strong now, but the shadow is timeless, and it can wait forever. The promises of safety have stopped, but the shadow's intentions have not changed. It is still there, waiting for the moment when David finally gives in. Deep down, he knows it's inevitable. One day, whether in a moment of fear, desperation, or exhaustion, his will might falter, and when that day comes, the shadow will be ready. It's a thought that terrifies him more than anything else, the idea that no matter how hard he fights, he might eventually lose. The shadow's patience is endless, and David knows that the moment he lets it in, there will be no escape. He doesn't know what will happen if he gives in, but he's certain that once the shadow gets what it wants, it won't be satisfied. The worst part is, the shadow doesn't need to hurry. It has all the time in the world, and David knows it's just waiting for him to slip, watching from the dark corners, ready to strike the moment his defenses fall. And when that moment comes, there will be no turning back. Emily Pearson grew up in the quiet countryside of Oregon, spending long, lazy summers at her grandparents' rural home. It wasn't a glamorous place, far from the bustling streets of the city, but it had a certain charm. The isolation was almost comforting. There was no one around for miles, just fields, trees, and the thick silence of nature. Emily, now a graphic designer in her early 30s, often looks back on those summers with a bittersweet nostalgia. She loved her grandparents dearly, and the quiet home had always felt like a safe haven. But there was one summer, when she was 12, that changed everything. That year, her cousin Ben came to stay with them. Ben was about the same age as Emily, and together, they roamed the woods, exploring every inch of the land. Their grandparents often warned them not to wander too far, especially into the deep parts of the forest. There were stories, old ones, that said some paths were cursed, that strange things happened to those who ventured too deep. But, as kids often do, Emily and Ben brushed off the warnings. After all, what could really happen in a sleepy little town where nothing exciting ever occurred? One afternoon, they found a path they'd never seen before, half hidden by overgrown brush. The trail seemed untouched, as if no one had walked it in years. The sunlight barely pierced through the dense canopy, making the air feel cooler, heavier. Ben, always the more adventurous one, urged Emily to follow him down the path. She hesitated, feeling a strange pull in her gut. But curiosity won. They ventured further, deeper into the unknown, each step taking them closer to something they weren't ready for. After walking for what felt like hours, they stumbled upon an old, decaying cabin. It was tucked away in a small clearing, its wooden boards rotting, windows shattered, and roof sagging under the weight of time. The place looked abandoned, forgotten, and Emily felt an eerie chill crawl up her spine. Ben, on the other hand, seemed thrilled. "We should check it out," he said, already moving toward the front door. Emily hesitated again, but Ben's excitement was infectious, and soon she found herself following him inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, something felt wrong. The air in the cabin was thick, almost oppressive. It was as if the cabin itself had been waiting for them, watching them from the moment they set foot on that path. But they didn't know that yet. Emily and Ben were just two curious kids, exploring a place they should have left alone. They had no idea they were stepping into something far darker than they could have ever imagined. That day marked the beginning of something Emily would never forget. The cabin, the silence, the way the air felt heavier with each passing second. It was only the start. There was something about that place, something that didn't want them to leave, and Emily would soon realize the consequences of their innocent curiosity. As Emily and Ben stepped inside, the atmosphere immediately shifted. The cabin felt alive in the strangest way, like it was breathing, or at least aware of their presence. The air was thick and stifling, and Emily noticed how still everything was. Too still. There wasn't a single sound. No birds outside, no wind rustling through the trees, not even the usual creaks of an old abandoned house settling into the earth. It was unnerving. Emily felt like the whole world had been placed on mute the moment they crossed the threshold. Ben, as usual, didn't seem bothered. He was already poking around, opening drawers and brushing aside cobwebs. "Come on, Em, it's just an old house," he said, flashing her a grin. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they shouldn't be there. The silence wasn't natural. It pressed in on her, almost making it hard to breathe. She found herself whispering, even though she didn't know why. It felt like speaking too loudly would disturb something ancient and sleeping. As they explored further, strange things started happening. It began with a faint whisper, so faint that at first Emily thought she was imagining it, but then it grew, ever so slightly, like a breeze barely brushing her ear. "Did you hear that?" she asked, turning to Ben, but he shook his head, focused on trying to pry open a door that was stuck. Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding a little faster. She wasn't imagining it. There was something in the air, something that sounded just like their own voices, but twisted, almost mocking. The more they moved through the cabin, the louder the whispers became. They didn't sound like words exactly, but more like echoes, repeating whatever Emily or Ben said, but in a strange, distorted tone. It was like the cabin was listening, absorbing their words, and then spitting them back at them in a way that sent chills down Emily's spine. She glanced at Ben, who was still moving around the place like nothing was wrong. "Do you really not hear that?" she asked again, her voice shaky this time. Ben finally stopped and looked at her, his brow furrowed. "You're being paranoid," he said with a shrug, but even he couldn't hide the slight tremor in his voice. The whispers were getting louder now, more insistent, repeating everything they said, only warped, like their voices were being stretched and twisted. Emily didn't want to admit it out loud, but she could feel the cabin closing in on them, like it was trapping them in its silence, its echoes. Every step they took felt like they were sinking deeper into something they couldn't escape. By the time they reached the farthest room, the whispers had become nearly deafening. Emily was practically frozen with fear, every nerve in her body screaming to leave. But when she turned back toward the front door, she realized with a sinking feeling that the door they had entered through was now closed, solid, as if it had never been opened. She didn't remember closing it, neither did Ben, and that's when they both heard it, a low, guttural laugh, echoing their own nervous giggles from earlier, only this time it wasn't just an echo. The moment they heard that unsettling, distorted laugh, both Emily and Ben froze. The sound was unlike anything Emily had ever heard. It was their voices, but not. The laugh was twisted, stretched, as if the cabin itself was mocking them, feeding off their fear. Emily's heart raced as she exchanged a terrified glance with Ben, who was no longer able to hide his unease. The silence, which had once felt oppressive, was now filled with something far worse. The cabin wasn't just a quiet, abandoned place. It was alive, aware of their presence, and it wasn't letting them leave easily. Ben was the first to move. He bolted toward the front door, yanking on the handle with all his might. The door that had once opened with no trouble wouldn't budge now, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. Emily felt the panic set in, her breathing quickening as she frantically looked around for another way out. The whispers had become voices now, mocking, distorted versions of their own, repeating their words but twisting them into something darker. "Let's go!" Ben shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. That's when Ben noticed the back door. It was a door Emily hadn't seen before, almost hidden in the shadows of the far corner. Without a word, Ben rushed toward it, determined to get out. Emily hesitated, the instinct to follow battling against the gnawing sense that something terrible would happen if they went through that door. But Ben didn't wait. He grabbed the handle, yanked it open, and stepped through. Emily watched, frozen in place, as her cousin vanished before her eyes. The second he crossed the threshold, it was as if he'd been swallowed whole by the darkness on the other side. There was no sound, no scream, no sign of him. He was just gone. Emily stood there in shock, her mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. She blinked, thinking maybe it was some trick of the light or her imagination playing tricks on her. But Ben was gone. He had simply disappeared into thin air. Panic surged through her, and she ran toward the door, but when she reached it, the door was gone too. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in on her. The voices grew louder, surrounding her, suffocating her. They were no longer just echoes. They were angry, sinister, and they were all fixated on her. Emily stumbled backward, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that it drowned out everything else. She called out for Ben, her voice trembling with fear, but the only response she got was her own voice, twisted and distorted, mocking her. "Ben's gone. He's not coming back," it seemed to say. Terror gripped her as she realized she was completely alone. The cabin wasn't letting her go, not yet. Emily's mind raced, trying to figure out what had just happened, where Ben had gone, and how she could get out. But the more she thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. The door had vanished. The whispers had become full-fledged voices, and something in the air felt different, darker, heavier. The cabin had claimed Ben, and now it was turning its attention to her. With nowhere else to turn, Emily pressed herself against the nearest wall, trying to calm her racing heart. But the voices wouldn't stop, growing louder and more chaotic, filling her head with fear. She realized with a sinking feeling that the cabin wasn't just some abandoned building, it was something much worse, and whatever it wasn't done with her yet. Emily's feet couldn't carry her fast enough as the front door suddenly flew open, almost as if the cabin itself had decided to release her. Without looking back, she ran, her heart pounding louder than her footsteps as she darted through the woods. The once calm and quiet forest now felt like a labyrinth of shadows, each tree watching her with silent malice. She didn't stop until she saw the faint outline of her grandparents' house in the distance. But even then, the terror in her chest didn't ease. Ben was gone, and there was no trace of where he had disappeared. Bursting into the house, breathless and trembling, Emily tried to explain what had happened. Her grandparents listened, concern etched into their faces, but the more she talked, the more their expressions shifted into disbelief. "Maybe you got lost," her grandfather said, shaking his head. "That cabin hasn't been there for decades. It burned down when I was a boy." Emily felt her stomach drop. Burned burned down? That couldn't be right. She had seen it, touched its rotting wood with her own hands. But her grandparents were insistent. There was no cabin anymore, and there hadn't been for years. The next few days were a blur of police searches and growing dread. Ben was officially declared missing, and everyone in town turned up to search the woods. But no one found a single trace of him. No footprints, no torn clothing, not even the path that had led them to the cabin. It was as if the entire place had vanished, just like Ben had. Emily's grandparents tried to comfort her, but she could see the worry in their eyes. They didn't say it, but she could tell they thought she was making the whole thing up, that maybe the shock of Ben disappearing had caused her to imagine it all. The thing was, Emily knew what she had seen. She knew the cabin was real, that the whispers had been real, and that something inside had taken Ben. But how could she convince anyone when the evidence had literally disappeared? As the days turned into weeks, Emily started to hear the echoes again. Only this time, they weren't confined to the cabin. They followed her. At first, it was just faint, almost imperceptible whispers at night, the kind you could almost chalk up to an overactive imagination. But as time went on, they grew louder. By the time school started again, Emily couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed her home. The whispers were with her constantly now, in her room, at school, even in the shower. They echoed her every word, but in that same distorted, mocking tone she had heard in the cabin. She tried telling her parents, but like her grandparents, they chalked it up to trauma. They were convinced that losing Ben had shaken her so deeply that her mind was playing tricks on her. But Emily knew better. The cabin, or whatever force had been in it, wasn't finished with her. It was one evening, not long after Ben's disappearance, that Emily finally understood the gravity of what had followed her. She was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to block out the faint whispers echoing in the back of her mind. Then, for the first time since that awful day, she heard it. Ben's voice. It wasn't just the echoes. It was him, calling her name from somewhere deep within the shadows of her room. Her blood ran cold. She knew it couldn't be him, not really. But the voice was so convincing, so familiar, it almost made her get out of bed to follow it. From that moment on, Emily lived in a constant state of fear. She knew the whispers weren't just memories or trauma. They were something far worse. Whatever had taken Ben wanted her too, and it wasn't going to stop until it had her. The cabin may have let her go, but its echoes were always there, reminding her that she wasn't safe, not yet. Years had passed, and yet the echoes never left her. Emily, now an adult living on her own, thought she might have been able to outrun the memories, but she was wrong. The whispers, once faint and sporadic, had become louder and more insistent, as if whatever was following her had grown stronger over time. She tried to drown them out with music, with background noise, but nothing worked. Every quiet moment was filled with those familiar distorted voices, mocking her, calling to her in the dead of night. Sometimes it was her own voice, other times it was Ben's. No one else ever heard it. Emily had learned not to tell people about it anymore. Friends, family, even therapists had all looked at her like she was crazy. After all, how could anyone believe something like this? It sounded like a nightmare, an overactive imagination, but Emily knew it was real. She could feel the presence growing stronger, especially in moments of silence. It was as if the echoes thrived on the quiet, feeding on the spaces where normal sounds should be. And so she lived in a world of constant noise, trying desperately to keep the voices at bay. The worst part wasn't just hearing the echoes, it was what they were becoming. In the beginning, they had only repeated her words, a strange and unsettling mimicry. But now they spoke on their own, saying things she hadn't said, twisting her thoughts, filling her head with dark, intrusive whispers. They would tell her to look in the mirror, to check the empty rooms of her apartment, to listen closely, as if they were right there, just out of sight. Emily resisted, but the temptation to listen was growing, the line between the echoes and her own mind blurring. It didn't help that the voices would often mimic Ben. Sometimes in the middle of the night she would hear him calling her name, as if he were standing right outside her bedroom door. Emily, the voice would say, soft at first, but growing louder until it was nearly impossible to ignore. She knew it wasn't really Ben, but hearing his voice, so familiar, so close, shook her to her core every time. She wanted to believe it was him, that somehow he had come back, but deep down, she knew better. It wasn't Ben. It was something else, something darker. Emily had tried everything to get rid of the echoes. She moved apartments, changed cities, even considered moving back to Oregon, thinking maybe if she confronted the source, she could make it stop. But nothing worked. The echoes followed her everywhere, growing louder, more menacing, as if they were waiting for her to break. She stopped looking in mirrors altogether, afraid of what she might see staring back at her. She avoided being alone in quiet spaces, knowing that was when the voices were the loudest. But there was no escaping them. They were part of her now. One night, as she sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the voices started again. Only this time, they didn't wait for her to speak first. "Emily," the voice whispered, low and menacing. "It's time." She froze, her heart pounding in her chest as the echoes grew louder, surrounding her from all sides. They no longer needed her to speak. They had learned to initiate their own conversation. And as they spoke, the air in the apartment grew cold, the shadows seemed to stretch, and she felt the familiar weight of something watching her. Emily knew this was only the beginning. The echoes were no longer content with just mimicking her or even speaking to her. They were getting stronger, bolder, and whatever they wanted, it wasn't just her voice they were after anymore. The endless echo that had haunted her for so many years was finally taking shape, and it wasn't going to stop until it had her completely.